He had never once waited for anything in his life. Raphael Mancino. No, wait, that name was taken. The list sat open in the back of her mind as Wren settled her tray against her hip and scanned the dining room. Apologies. Let me go straight into the story. Cormack Vane had never once waited for anything in his life. Not a table, not a contract, not a man's last breath. So when the hostess at Bellamies informed him, politely with shaking hands, that his usual corner booth was still occupied, he did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply looked at her, and the color drained from her face so completely that the woman at the adjacent table quietly gathered her purse and left without finishing her wine. The booth cleared in 40 seconds. Bellamies was not a restaurant in the way that most people understood restaurants. It did not have a Yelp page. It did not take walk-ins. Its address was not listed anywhere that a civilian would think to look. The chef, a former Le Cordon Bleu instructor named Hargrove, had once told a food journalist that Bellamies catered to a very particular clientele. The journalist had decided, wisely, not to press further. What Bellamies actually was: the cleanest place in Chicago to conduct business that could not be conducted anywhere else. Cormack Vane knew this better than anyone. He had, after all, been largely responsible for making it so. He was 41 years old. He had the kind of face that photographs well, and in person made people instinctively step back. Not ugly, not frightening in any obvious way, but carrying something behind the eyes that registered in the human nervous system as a warning. His jaw was a clean line. His hands were steady. He wore a charcoal suit that had been cut for him specifically, and he wore it the way a man wears a thing he has owned so long it has become part of his body. Two of his men took positions near the entrance without being told. A third settled at the bar with a glass of water he would not touch. Cormack sat. He did not look at the menu. He never looked at the menu. He was reviewing a set of numbers in his head. A discrepancy in the Halcyon account that his financial officer had flagged that morning, small enough to be a rounding error, large enough to be something else, when the woman arrived at his table. He noticed her the way he noticed most things, peripherally, categorically, filed and dismissed in under a second. Female, mid-30s, Bellamies uniform, which meant black trousers, white shirt, small gold pin, round face, wide hips. The kind of build that certain tabloids would describe with a meanness they disguised as concern. She set down a glass of still water without being asked. He did not look up. "Mr. Vane." Her voice was even. Not deferential, not nervous. Just even. "I'll be taking care of you this evening. Can I start you with something from the bar, or would you prefer to go straight to the kitchen selections tonight?" He looked up then. She was already watching him. Not the way the hostess had watched him, not with the whites of her eyes showing, not with the particular stillness of a person calculating how to survive the next 30 seconds. She was watching him the way a person watches a crossword puzzle. Like he was something to be worked out. He found that, in a vague and distant way, interesting. "Water is fine," he said. "Of course." She produced a small leather folder. "Chef Hargrove is offering a duck confit this evening that I'd genuinely recommend, if that matters. He's been working on the cherry reduction for 3 days, and he's unbearable about it." There was a pause. One of his men at the bar shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. Cormack Vane looked at the woman, really looked at her, the way he looked at things when they required actual attention, and said, "What's your name?" "Faye," she said. "Faye Callister." "How long have you worked here, Faye Callister?" 4 years. "Then you know who I am." "Yes, and you're telling me about duck confit." She tilted her head just slightly, not defiant. Something more precise than defiant. "I'm doing my job, Mr. Vane, which is to make sure you have a good meal. The duck is genuinely good. Whether that's relevant to you is your business." He studied her for another moment. Then he said, "The duck, and whatever Hargrove thinks pairs with it." "Good choice," she said, and wrote nothing down and walked away. She did not hurry. Cormack watched her go. Then he returned to the numbers in his head. the discrepancy in the Halcyon account. $63,000, shifted in increments small enough to avoid the automatic flags, but consistent enough, spaced at intervals that suggested not carelessness but patience. Someone in his organization was patient. That was, of all the things they could have been, the most dangerous thing to be. Faye Callister had been patient her whole life. It was not, she would have told you, a virtue she'd chosen. It was a thing she'd developed the way people develop calluses, by being pressed on, repeatedly, until the soft parts toughened. She had grown up in Cicero, Illinois, in a house that was always too small and never quite warm enough. The second of 4 children, the one nobody worried about, because she was so relentlessly, quietly fine. She had put herself through community college doing data entry for an insurance company, and then through UIC doing accounting on a combination of loans, night shifts, and a scholarship that required her to maintain a GPA she had maintained with the same grim efficiency she brought to everything else. She had not gotten the job at Bellamies through any connection or stroke of luck. She had gotten it because her predecessor, a man named Stitch, which was not his real name but the only one anyone used, had quietly recommended her on his way out, and because she had shown up to the interview in a room with no windows and 3 men who were clearly not in the restaurant industry, and answered every question without flinching. And because when one of those men had asked, "What do you do when you see something you're not supposed to see?" she had said, without hesitating, "I forget it immediately and thoroughly," which was the correct answer. She had been doing that for 4 years. She was very good at it. What she was less good at, what she had never quite mastered, despite sustained effort, was being unaware of herself in a room. She knew, in the precise and specific way that plus-size women tend to know such things, exactly how much space she occupied. She knew which booths she fit into easily and which required a slight adjustment. She knew the particular quality of the glance, the flick of the eyes, the almost not there recalibration that happened when she walked into a space where people were not expecting her. She had, over time, developed an immunity to it, or something close enough to immunity that it functioned the same way. When Cormack Vane had looked at her, that first assessing sweep, the kind that took in every detail and assigned it a value, she had felt it, and she had filed it away, and she had done her job. She was doing her job. She was not thinking about the way he'd said her name, the slight pause before it, like he was testing the weight of it. She was absolutely, completely not thinking about that. She put in the order for the duck. The problem arrived approximately 40 minutes later, in the form of a man named Bellacort. Faye knew him the way she knew most of Bellamy's regulars. By name, by drink, by the specific shape of the trouble he carried. Bellacort was mid-50s, real estate money gone sideways into other kinds of money, the kind of man who laughed at his own jokes before he finished them. He had 3 drinks minimum before 9 p.m. on any given evening, and tonight he had arrived already past that threshold, which meant his voice was carrying in the way that voices carry when their owner has lost interest in modulating them. He was also, unfortunately, seated 2 tables from Cormack Vane, and he had noticed Faye. "Hey," he said it to her back as she passed. "Hey, sweetheart, you knew?" She turned, kept her face neutral. "No, Mr. Bellacort. I've been here 4 years. 4 years." He leaned back in his chair, looked her over with the particular brand of cheerful contempt that drunken men sometimes confuse for charisma. "Huh. How'd I miss you? You're hard to miss." He looked at the man across from him, some associate, someone she didn't recognize, and laughed at something he hadn't said yet. Faye said, "Can I get you anything?" "You sure can." He gestured vaguely at her, a wave that was meant to encompass her entire body. "Tell me something. They have weight requirements here? For the staff? Because I feel like they should." The associate across from him made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite discomfort, something between the two. Faye said nothing. She had a formula for this. Breathe in, locate the exit strategy, deploy it cleanly. "I'll let your server know you need the check," she said, and began to turn. "I'm serious." Bellacort's voice had an edge now, the edge that came when a man like this sensed he was being managed and didn't like it. "I'm a paying customer. I'm asking a genuine question. How does someone your size? That's enough." The voice came from behind her, low, perfectly calibrated. The kind of voice that didn't need to get loud because it had never needed to get loud. Because in every room Cormac Vane had ever entered, the air had simply rearranged itself around him, and the people in it had understood, on a level below conscious thought, that they existed at his convenience. Bellacort went very still. Faye turned. Cormac was standing. He had not stood up in a hurry. He had simply, at some point in the last few seconds, stood, and now he was looking at Bellacort with the expression of a man who has found something mildly distasteful on the bottom of his shoe. "You were saying?" Cormac said. Bellacort's mouth opened, closed. You were just leaving." Cormac's eyes moved briefly to the associate across the table. "Both of you." There was a moment, a very short moment, in which the room seemed to understand what was happening before the people in it did. Then Bellacourt pushed back his chair and stood, and said something that was probably intended as dignity, but landed as retreat, and he and his associate were gone. Faye stood in the space they had occupied and breathed. Cormac looked at her. "Thank you," she said, because it was the true and right thing to say, and she was not going to not say it. "Don't thank me," he said, and something in his voice had shifted. Not softer, exactly, but different. "That wasn't for you. That was because stupidity in my vicinity gives me a headache." She looked at him. "That's a very convenient thing to tell yourself." He said nothing. "I'll check on your dessert course," she said, and walked away. And she did not look back. And she was shaking, just slightly, in the hands, the way she always shook after a thing like that, the adrenaline finding its way out. But she made it to the kitchen before it showed. Hargrove was plating the last of a creme brulee when she came in. "You good?" he said, without looking up. "Fine," she said. He looked up. He had known her 4 years. "Bellacort. He left. Who handled it?" She was quiet for a moment. "Vane." Hargrove set down his torch. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Faye, I know," she said. "That man doesn't do anything without a reason." "I know," she said again. "I know." She picked up the dessert tray and went back out. She found the number 3 days later. She had not been looking for it. That was the thing. She had not gone looking. Because looking was the fastest way to find something that got you killed. And she knew that, had always known that. It was the first and most important thing she had internalized in her first week at Bellamies, when Stitch had sat across from her and said, "The secret to lasting here is simple. You see everything, and you pursue nothing." But she was a woman who had spent her adult life doing other people's books, and numbers had a way of making themselves visible to her, the way that misspelled words made themselves visible to copy editors. Involuntary, indelible. She didn't choose to see them. They simply presented themselves. She had been running the end-of-month reconciliation for Bellamy's operating accounts, a task that fell to her because she was the only front-of-house staff member who had an accounting background, and because Hargrove trusted her, and because it was easier than explaining the books to an outside firm. When she saw it. $63,000, moved in pieces. 12 transactions over 6 weeks, each one small enough to miss if you weren't the kind of person who noticed. She was the kind of person who noticed. She sat very still. She looked at the numbers for a long time. Then she closed the ledger and went home and lay on her ceiling in the dark and thought about what Stitch had told her and thought about what she knew and thought about what the right thing to do was. And at approximately 2 in the morning, she arrived at an answer that she immediately wished she hadn't. She requested a meeting through the hostess, which was the proper channel, which meant she wrote a note on Bellamy's stationery and handed it to the woman at the front desk and said, "If Mr. Vane's office asks, I have an accounting matter that requires his attention." And then she went home and waited, and was almost certain she'd just signed her own death warrant. The response came in 8 hours, Tuesday, 7 p.m. Same table. She arrived at 6:45. He was already there. He looked at her as she approached. That same assessing look, the same catalogue running behind the eyes, and said nothing as she sat across from him, which she had not been invited to do but did anyway. Because she had decided on the walkover that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it without apology. "You found it," he said. Not a question. She looked at him. "You knew about it." For 10 days, he turned his water glass a quarter turn. "I've been watching to see who else found it, and now you know, and now I know." He looked at her steadily. "The question is what you're going to do with it." "I'm going to tell you what I found," she said. "And then I'm going to go back to my job and forget I ever saw it. That's what I do. That's what I've always done. And if I told you I needed more than that..." She felt something cold move through her. "What does more look like?" "I need to know where it's going," he said. "The money. My people are looking, but they're looking at the obvious places. You found it in a set of books that my financial officer signed off on, which means whoever's doing this is moving it through the legitimate side, through something that looks like operating expenses." She understood then what he was asking. "You want me to trace it," she said. "I want you to do what you already did," he said, "but further." She should have said no. She knew she should have said no. She ran the calculation in her head. Risk of saying yes versus risk of saying no to Cormack Vane, and found that the math did not, in any direction, produce a comfortable answer. "If I do this," she said, "and I find what you're looking for, what happens to me after?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not much, a degree or two, the way a very controlled thing sometimes shows a seam. "Nothing happens to you," he said. "You have my word. Your word." "Yes, that's what men like you always say." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something adjacent to one. "That's true," he said. "It is what men like me say. It's also, in this case, true." She looked at him. She was looking for the lie, had been trained by 4 years in this place by a lifetime of watching people more closely than they watched themselves. To find the lie, she could not find it. "2 conditions," she said. He waited. "I work alone. None of your people in the room with me." She held up a finger. "And if this goes wrong, if whoever's doing this finds out I'm looking, you get me out. Not afterward. Not after something happens, at the first sign." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Done," she stood. "I'll need access to the full operating ledger going back 18 months. You'll have it tomorrow morning." She nodded, turned to go. "Faye." She stopped. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the specific tone of a man encountering something he had not encountered before and was attempting to categorize. She looked at him over her shoulder. "I'm afraid of plenty of things, Mr. Vane. You're just not near the top of the list." She left. He watched the space she had occupied for a long moment after she was gone. Then he picked up his water glass and drank. It took her 9 days. 9 days of arriving early and staying late, of working through the operating ledger with the particular kind of focus that felt, to Faye, less like concentration and more like falling, like the numbers had gravity, and she was simply following it down. She did not tell Hargrove what she was doing. She did not tell anyone. She came in, she worked her tables. She went to the back office after close, and she spread the numbers across the desk like a puzzle, and she worked. On the 4th day, she found the routing. On the 6th day, she found the name. She sat with the name for 2 days, which was the hardest 2 days of her professional life, because the name was not who she had expected it to be. The name was someone she had poured coffee for, someone who had tipped her decently on a Tuesday in March and asked how her week was going. On the 9th day, she called the number she had been given. He came alone. or as alone as a man like Cormack Vane ever came, which meant 2 men stayed in the car and 1 stayed near the door, and he sat across from her in the back office of Bellamies, with his jacket on and his hands folded, and looked at the documents she had printed and said nothing for a very long time. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm an accountant," she said. "This is what I do." He was quiet again. She watched him read through the second document, the one with the routing numbers and the shell company and the name at the end of it, and she watched something move through his face, something cold and final, and very, very old, and she understood that whoever's name was on that page was already living in their last days, and she felt sick about it, and she also felt, distantly, that there was nothing she could have done differently. "You did good work," he said. "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Don't tell me I did good work, and then—" She stopped, started again. "I need to know that I'm clear, that this doesn't, that I can go back to my life." He was looking at her differently than he had before. She couldn't quite name what was different. It was something in the quality of his attention, like she had taken up more of it than she was supposed to. Like the space she occupied in his awareness had expanded past the category he'd originally assigned her to. "You're clear," he said. "You've been clear since Tuesday." "Then why are you still here?" He said nothing for a moment. "Then, I don't know." That was, she realized, probably the truest thing he had said to her in the 3 weeks she had known him, possibly the truest thing he had said to anyone in a very long time. She looked at him. He looked at her. The office was very quiet. Outside, Hargrove was doing something with pans that produced a series of distant clangs. "The duck was excellent, by the way," Cormack said. She blinked. "What?" "The duck confit, that first night." "You were right." The cherry reduction was. He paused. Hargrove had reason to be pleased with himself. She stared at him. "You're talking about the duck. I'm making conversation." "You're—" She stopped. She thought, with some incredulity, that she might laugh. She didn't laugh. She sat with the almost law and the strangeness of the moment, and the fact that Cormack Vane, the most dangerous man in this city, the man whose name made restaurant owners clear tables in 40 seconds, the man who had just quietly received information that would end someone's life, was sitting across from her in a back office talking about duck confit. "I thought you didn't do anything without a reason," she said. "I don't." "So what's the reason for this?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm still working that out," he said, and for the first time she saw something behind his eyes that wasn't calculation. "Just something." A door left slightly open that was usually closed. She stood up, gathered the copies of the document she was keeping, her own insurance, the kind that Stitch had told her to always keep, the kind that meant she was never entirely without leverage. She put on her coat. "Faye," he said. She waited. "My driver will take you home tonight." He said it like it wasn't a question, like it was simply a fact that had already been established. She opened her mouth to refuse. "Indulge me," he said quietly. She thought about it. She thought about the name on the page and what that meant, and the fact that she was walking home through Chicago in November, and that she had just spent 9 days doing something that had painted a target of some size on her back. "Fine," she said, "but I'm not making conversation with the driver. He won't expect it. He doesn't speak much English." "Then we'll get along perfectly," she said, and she walked out, and she did not look back, and she did not need to look back to know that he was still watching the doorway after she was gone. The man on the page was dealt with in the way that men like Cormack Vane dealt with things, which was quietly and completely, and Faye did not ask about it, and was not told, and that was how it was supposed to work. What was not supposed to work, what did not follow any established pattern or precedent that Faye could identify, was what came after. A bottle of wine arrived at her apartment building 2 days later. No note. A label she recognized from Bellamy's cellar, the kind that didn't have a price printed on it, because the price was the sort of number that would seem rude to print. The week after that, she arrived at Bellamy's for her shift, and found that her locker had been upgraded. It was a minor thing, a small thing, the kind of thing that could have been a coincidence. The week after that, a car appeared outside her building at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday when she was walking home from a late close, and the window rolled down, and Cormack Vane said, without preamble, "Get in, it's cold." She stood on the sidewalk in her coat and her good shoes, and the Chicago November pressed down on her from all directions. "This isn't in my job description," she said. "No," he said, "it isn't." She got in the car. They drove for a while without speaking, which she found, to her own surprise, not uncomfortable. He was not a man who filled silence out of nervousness. He let it sit there without fidgeting, and she had always found people who could do that more bearable than the ones who couldn't. "Where are we going?" she said finally. "Nowhere in particular," he said. "I have a meeting in an hour. I had time." "So you drove to my building?" "Yes." She looked out the window. The city passed, lit up and cold, the lake visible in the distance, the kind of November night that Chicago specialized in, the kind that got into your bones. "That's strange," she said. "I know," he said. "You should probably stop doing it." "Probably," he agreed. He did not stop. She did not ask him to stop after that. Not really. She told herself she would, the next time. And then the next time came, and she found that the telling herself was the thing she was doing, not the asking him to stop, and that these were two different things, and she had been confusing them. It was Hargrove who said it eventually, because Hargrove was the kind of man who said things. He said it on a Thursday morning when she came in early to do the month-end books and found him already there, and he set down a cup of coffee in front of her without being asked and said, "Be careful with that man, Faye." She looked at him. "I know," he said. "I know you know. I know you're the smartest person in any room you're in, and I know that helps you a lot in a lot of situations." He looked at his hands. "It doesn't always help with this kind of situation." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. It was hot. Grounding. "I'm not doing anything," she said. "I know you're not," he said. "I just want you to know that when you are, if you are, you can be careful and still get it wrong. That's all I'm saying." She thought about that for a long time. She thought about it later that night when the car was there again at 11 p.m., and she stood on the sidewalk for just a moment longer than usual. And then she got in, and Cormack was in the back seat with his jacket loosened and his tie undone, which was the most undone she had ever seen him, and he looked at her with that look that was getting harder and harder to categorize as purely assessing. "You look like you're deciding something," he said. "I usually am," she said. "What is it this time?" She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what Hargrove had said. She thought about the wine and the locker and the car at 11 p.m. on cold Wednesdays. She thought about the duck confit and the way he'd said, "I'm still working that out," like it had cost him something to admit. "You could just say it," she said. "Whatever this is, you could just say it." A pause. The city moved past the windows. "I don't know how," he said quietly. It's not evasion. I genuinely don't know how." She believed him. That was the thing. She kept believing him, which was not a thing she was accustomed to doing with powerful men, and it unsettled her in a way she was still working through. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "I'm saying okay," she said, "to whatever this is, on the condition that you talk to me like a person and not like a resource you're managing. On the condition that when something is wrong, you tell me instead of protecting me from it." He was very still. "I'm not easy to have around," she said. "I notice everything. I keep records. I have opinions about the way things are done, and I express them." She met his eyes. "I am also extremely good at what I do, and I am not going to apologize for how much space I take up." Something crossed his face. Not the controlled thing she usually saw there. Something raw. "I'm not asking you to," he said. "Good," she said. The car drove on. The lake was a dark suggestion beyond the buildings, the November sky pressing low and black and cold over all of it. The cherry reduction, he said after a while. She looked at him. Hargroves. You said he was unbearable about it. The corner of his mouth moved. He was right to be. She thought about not smiling. She did not succeed. Don't tell him that. He'll be impossible for weeks. I'll tell him anyway, Cormack said, and the smile reached his eyes just at the edges, and she thought, there it is, and the car was warm, and Chicago moved past in the dark, and she had, somehow against every reasonable calculation she'd ever made, ended up somewhere she hadn't planned to be. She stayed anyway.